Hi, my name is Jasmine, and I'm going to be presenting my essay plan, which is focusing on an adolescent identity crisis in reference to Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. And my objectives for this will be to argue that although Erik Erikson's trajectory acts as a basic framework for psychosocial development, it is not completely parallel to every individual. And secondly, I'll be arguing that identity is a very unstable and ambiguous concept, and it can be dependent on a range of factors as well as age. And then finally, I'll be arguing that identity it definitely is crystallized around late adolescence, as individuals tend to experience ego diffusion at that time rather than their older counterparts in adulthood. So that's countering the ideas of a midlife crisis. So then my evidence to support this will first be gathered from Sneed and others in 2008 who tested that trust, identity, and ego integrity, modeling Erikson's core stages over 34 years. And the aim was to investigate the idea that while individuals do share the common traits of continuity and wholeness during the period of adulthood, each stage encompasses unique developmental paths and trajectories in life. So the method for this began as the participants were in college, and they were tested in 11-year intervals. And they were obtaining stage scores for each stage. So they were assessed using a Q sort, which assessed their positive or negative resolution from each stages. So 80 items were obtained, 10 from each stage. 5 represented the positive resolution, and then 5 represented the negative resolution. So, for example, for stage 5, the representative positive items were I know who I am and what I want out of life, which was a representative of identity achievement. And then the negative item would be I never know how I feel, representing identity diffusion. So then the participant would have to indicate how characteristic or uncharacteristic those two items would be on a 7-point scale. And then their stage score could be calculated accordingly by subtracting the sum of the 5 negative items on each scale from the sum of the 5 positive items. So then the results for this indicate they presented it on a table and a graph. So table 1 shows that the stages 1 and 5 scores increased over time, whereas stage 8 scores decreased from the first to the second testing, and then they increased again from the third one and the fourth one. And then the standard deviations that are listed above, they also indicate that the variance for each of the stages were relatively homogeneous throughout the testing. And then on the graph here, it shows a fitted linear trajectory in bold. So that represents stage 5. So for the average participant. And then so these results indicate that the distinct developmental trajectories across young and middle adulthood in all these stages, which is consistent with Erikson's prediction that the timing of each stage is unique for every individual, even though the underlying dynamic of the progression of one's identity is generally indifferent. So it also indicates that there is individual variability when it comes to the pace and the ease to which someone reaches the identity. And therefore, although the trajectory acts as a basic framework for psychosocial development, it is not completely parallel to every individual, which is in support of Erik Erikson's theory. So then my second source of evidence is entitled Identity Formation in Adolescence, Change or Stability, which aim to examine how adolescent identity formation is best described. And then it further seeks to clarify the inconsistent pattern of development and it's inconsistent pattern of development of commitment found in previous studies. So previous studies found an inconsistent pattern of commitment, and so they're seeking to clarify that instability. So then the method for this was conducted by collecting 1,313 participants who were found in high school, and they were divided into two separate groups depending on their age. These were early to middle adolescents with an average of 12 to 13-year-olds, and then the middle to late adolescents, which was average of 16 to 17. So this was in the first wave of measurement in which the experiment began. And then in order to test the range of 12 to 20 years old, they had to be assessed in 5 measurement waves over 8 years using the Urate Management of Identity Commitment Scale as a self-report. So they were able to assess the ideological and the interpersonal domains of the participant's identity. And then the results show through this table that that the stability levels of commitment and in-depth exploration and reconsideration were reported by participants through the 3 lines that indicate each of those. So the top one's commitment, then the second one's in-depth exploration, then the last one's reconsideration. So the levels of commitment indicate no reasonable meaningful changes over time. So it indicates that it was pretty consistent throughout the whole experiment. Whereas reconsideration and exploration, they do alter specifically when reaching the age of 16. So you can see as it reaches the point of 16, then it starts to alter. So commitment levels were also quite high in both middle to late boys and girls. So that can be interpreted as a normative trend for adolescents. And then the other two indicate the instability of the identity achievement and thus prove the state of adolescence as a critical period for identity discovery. And also the variation in data for the sexes also indicate that it is not only age that affects identity, but gender can also alter the pace in which the stages are achieved. So then my final source is entitled Empirical Validation of Erikson's Theory of Identity Crisis in Late Adolescence. And this one was aimed to examine the relationship between ego and identity fusion, and anxiety within Erikson's framework of psychosocial theory. So for this one, they gathered 507 students, which were aged 17 to 24, and they were tested using 3 instruments. So the first one was the ego identity scale, which was a measure of ego identity diffusion and crystallization, which was assessed by a paper and pencil test. And then the second one was the IPAT anxiety scale, which was a measure of anxiety, which consisted of 50 items, which each item was a weight of 1. Then the max score was 50, and therefore the higher the score, the higher the anxiety level. And then the final instrument that was used was the self-report inventor, which was just a general indicator of the internal state. And they were all of them were ensured confidentiality about their answers. And then so the results show from these tables, you can see that there was the correlation coefficient shows that there was a significantly above the level of confidence, and it corroborates with previous research indicating that there is a negative relationship between ego identity and anxiety. And then within the table 2 shows that within the 21 to 24 age band, there was also significantly less ego diffusion for females than males did. So the results for that provide empirical support for Erikson's theory of adolescent identity crisis, as the significant differences were apparent between age groups and grade levels, which indicate that late adolescence identity processes crystallize at that time. And moreover, it does provide further association between sex and resolution of an identity crisis, as females did report to experience identity diffusion less than males. So then that was my final piece of evidence. And as we evaluate these evidences, we can come to the agreement that all 3 of these sources are valid in their expert authors. Like, all the authors provided their credentials as experts in this field. That they were all journal articles, so it's valid support in regards to that. However, the conduction of the study do have strengths and weaknesses when you assess the method. So for the source one, the study strength for it is how it went over 34 years, which increases reliability as it analyzes all stages of development. And it was quoted in the article, it was the only 34-year longitudinal study that systematically examines all Erikson stages for men and women from early to middle adulthood. So that is the strength. And then the weakness for this is that the year of the commencement. So it was commenced in the 1990s. So it could be outdated because it was during a time where social influences such as social media weren't of great influence. So like nowadays maybe people could argue that social media can be a great influence of one's identity. And the long period of the study causes attrition. So because it's a long period, the is more likely for participants to drop out and to alter the results, as it's the original sample wouldn't be identical to the final sample. So the second source, also a strength of that, is it has a large sample, as it's over 1,000 participants that were categorized by their personal traits, so that could avoid attrition, because as people drop out over the years, they're able to resolve that by categorizing each individual by their traits, so that it could be more similar in that way. So, and a weakness of that is the inner conflicts and crises are hard to detect in long-term studies, because it was assessed with 1-year intervals between assessments. So because the intervals were so great, it's hard to detect inner conflicts and crises in that sense. So then the third source, strength, includes individual self-reports as to state individual differences and potential biases. It states that in the article, and it provides support for both developmental and socio-cultural aspects of the theory of ego identity development. And then a weakness of it would be it needed to isolate, as it stated in the article, that in further studies they would need to isolate more precisely the crisis fluctuation of this development stage, because it wasn't done as well in the experiment, and it doesn't precisely isolate the crisis fluctuation in development stages. So yeah, and then in conclusion, my contention for this essay would be that although adolescence is a critical period of identity formation, there are individual differences that indicate the ambiguity of adolescence, which can be affected by other variables such as sex. And then my objectives were to argue that identity is formed in late adolescence due to ego fusion rather than in adulthood. And then secondly, the trajectory acts as a basic framework for psychosocial development, and it is not completely parallel to every individual. And then finally, identity is unstable and ambiguous and dependent on a range of factors. So then my sources were collated from, as stated below in this PowerPoint, and they were all able to support these arguments in a variety of ways, and tested the idea that identity is formed at 18. And yep, so here are my references. Thank you for watching.